Alrighty, so this one's going to be quite a big video and quite possibly in two parts to try and explore and go through this and make it as simplified as possible. So, what I'm going to be covering today is a little bit of psychoanalytic theory, which is coming from Sigmund Freud and another theorist. So, the reasons that we look at theorists in level three is that they allow us to broaden out, they allow that wider world connection and that contextual connection without saying it's just like North Korea or Donald Trump. So it allows you to sort of show a broader understanding. It allows you to recognize the complexity of humans and look at how literature helps us explore that. So it's got sort of the opportunity to build you up a grade level. So if you've got a really achieved level essay, but you have a little bit of psychoanalytical theory or a consideration of theory, then it often helps lift you just from the A4 into the M5 territory. And much the same, it can take you from the M6 into the E7. So that doesn't guarantee you that you're going to get it. It's not like a tick box, but if you kind of understand it, or you can sort of pull out a couple of phrases that do it, it can definitely help to create a depth around your analysis. So, to begin on what that means, Sigmund Freud is or was a theorist, so he had a lot of sort of psychoanalytical, so to do with the brain theories, which had different stages to do with development. So his whole thing was that your childhood experiences form your unconscious brain, and that desires fuel your behavior. So that there was a certain amount that you could attribute to what you experienced in childhood. And it's a theory, so there are extents to which you can support it or not support it. But I'm just going to introduce you to a real basic aspect of his, and then we're just going straight into a paper that kind of gives it a little bit more of a concrete base with our text. So his is based on this idea of our conscious and our unconscious, which is everything we're aware of, but also our unconscious is like if you've got an iceberg, at the tip of the iceberg is the conscious, and the unconscious is the largest part of our mind. And a lot of our stuff that we do, we don't even think about. And then he divided this into kind of three mental structures: the id, the ego, and the superego. So I'm not going to go into super large detail on those. You are more than welcome to research them in your own time. But your id is your unconscious part, and it demands immediate gratification. So that's kind of your impulsive, present self. The ego is a combination of both of those things and is the more regulated part of your brain that looks for long-term gratification. So playing the long game and getting what you want that way. And then your superego is your moral compass. And then obviously Freud believed that different things that happened in your childhood experience kind of impacted those three mental structures and maybe made your id a lot more present in your life as opposed to your superego or your ego. And the other one is Jacques Lacan. So he was popular in the 50s to 80s as a practicing theorist, and he was French. So he responded to Freud's theories with his own commentary, and he has similar takes on some things, but expands them further. So Freud and Lacan work really well, largely in unison together. That you can see the theories, and you can talk about both of them kind of side by side in an essay, and it won't contradict yourself too much. So he has a similar take, but he also kind of goes from that ego, super ego thing into doing that you've got like a imaginary, a realistic, and a symbolic identity. So he kind of gave some different phrases with slight differences, but by and large, that's it. And his is this big idea of a mirror state that as a child, when we first see ourselves in the mirror and recognize ourselves to be a person, that is the beginning of ourselves as an identity. And then when the parents witness this too, it's this big moment where we're all realizing that you're a human, and therefore your identity starts from that moment. Okay, cool. So what I've done is, if you look down the bottom here in blue, yeah, I have found this really good report by Eisling Hearns from the it's like a psychology arts journal. And I'll let the link there, and this is what is referenced the entire way through this. So what I've done is taken out bits that are most relevant and then highlighted bits that are further relevant that you can copy for your own notes. If it is in italics, it is mine, or my summaries or my words, and so by and large it is Eiling Hearns' words. Okay, so I'm definitely not taking any pride on that one, but there's just some really, really good stuff. It is a very long article, but I would totally recommend, if you've got a bit of time, finding or following that link, copying it in and looking it up, because there's heaps. There's so much that I haven't even touched on from there. So that paper looks at the idea of Lacan and Freud, and then applies those theories to Richard III and the actions and the evidence in Richard III. In this PowerPoint, I put most of the evidence in bold as well, just so it's easier to copy down to form your quotes or notes. This is going to be a long effort, but it is really worthwhile. And even if you can't necessarily take away the theoretical components, the ideas are really good. So if we can't take away the theory, at least we can take away that. So the report starts with this idea of what a tragedy is. So if it was just a straight historical play, some people would see Richard III as a history play, but as a tragedy play, it can also be there. But a tragedy can only be a tragedy when the audience has some way to identify with the main character. So you need someone to be tragic. And so to be tragic, there needs to be some way of them also being a hero. So you might not think about it with Richard III, but by Richard being exciting, dark, and witty, he creates the tragedy through that. Because even though we can view him as a straight evil character, if we have that other side to him, the other thing that we see as an audience, it creates a more emotional engagement through it. So the audience knows that he deserves to die, but there's still a sense of tragedy when he does and how he does. And when we look further into his character and what's formed it, perhaps it makes it arguably a little bit more tragic when we see his undoing of identity at the end of the play. So the other idea of this is also that the reason why the play is so impactful and why plays in literature in general is that they allow people to experience the raw and painful side of humanity. I just thought that was really nice phrasing. So what you're meant to be doing while we're doing this is pausing the video, taking down what is most relevant, taking down notes that I'm saying verbally, and just finding kind of some good quality notes to take away from this, and then build your own understanding from those notes. So Freud calls people like Richard's character an exception. So I'll look at that in a little bit more detail later, but the exceptions are basically people that are above certain laws. So he has failed to move on beyond the pleasure principle and has not come into the reality principle, and that's a result of his childhood deformity. So Richard claims that he's become a villain because of boredom, and because he is bored and he can't have a lover, so that's what he's going to do. And so as an audience member looking at it, it's kind of evident that you can think that there must be something deeper that's going on, and that can create a sense of sympathy. Now, throughout this, you might disagree, but I'd write the notes down and then write next to it why you disagree. Because as I said, these are theories and interpretations of the text, and that's entirely up to you whether you want to go with that or not. So it said here that Richard is an enormous magnification of something we find in ourselves as well. We all think we have a reason to reproach nature and our destiny for congenital and infantile disadvantages. We all demand reparation for early wounds to our narcissism. So to summarize that into plain English, basically stuff happens to us when we're children, and it might be in the sense that it could be something physical like Richard, or it could just be a disadvantage like a absent parent, a sibling that gets more attention. And so we are narcissists, so we're obsessed with ourselves at a young age, because you are purely in your id phase of life, and you're only about yourself at that point in time. And some of us grow out of that and some of us don't. And so we expect that people should feel sorry for us and allow us to work through that pain and suffering. So people that don't work through it and hold on to it, they're the exception. So they believe they're above the law. And Richard is an exception. He believes that he is above everyone else because he is owed something because he was deformed. And I talked before about the idea of involuntary celibates and how incels, how they think they're sort of owed something because people won't give it to him. And it's that same kind of a thing that I feel like Richard thinks he's owed something more because something was taken away from him. So as an audience member, you have to sympathize, arguably, that you can think about similar circumstances or at least feel sorry for him for having to go through that and wonder whether we too feel a sense of disadvantage about anything that we feel like we haven't experienced. So Shakespeare wrote this character in such a way that it leaves it open for interpretation, and by doing this, it allows us to do what we do best as an audience and find something on which we identify. So you don't have to identify with Richard, but you might, and if not, you might find a sympathy, and if none of that, you might just be able to go the opposite direction and find that his exceptions or the state of an exception in Freud's eyes is ridiculous, and that he shouldn't have that. Another thing to remember, just down the bottom there, is that earlier in the year we did the ADT theory, so affective disposition theory, which said that we have to find a moral connection with a text to enjoy it. And Freud thinks that that moral connection doesn't have to be a positive moral engagement, and it may actually rely on the opposite. So we don't need to be positively morally engaged. In fact, in the negative state and our negative view of Richard, we might find moral engagement through that and through how he makes us question that. Okay. So the psychopathy of Big Rich. So psychopaths is a theory or a title. There's a little bit of quandary over whether anyone can be a psychopath, and there isn't really solid medical diagnoses of them, but that's something to consider. So I'll just give you a moment to start reading some of those, and then I'll talk through it. So as it starts at the beginning there, it talks about how Richard manages to kill 11 people without so much as touching them. He has these callous and ruthless deeds carried out on those closest to him because of his ambition to gain access to the crown. See why I like this? The writing's just so good. Richard wins over person after person with his charm whilst writing a tide of blood and pathological lies. His use of language is engaging and clever, and his sense of humour dark yet provoking. But when reading this article and reading others, there's a suggestion that the slight regret and remorse that Richard shows towards the end of the play in Act 5 counteracts typical or classical discussions around psychopathic. So he does show traits of aggressive narcissism, such as superficial charm, pathological lying, manipulative and callous behaviour, and a failure to accept responsibility for his actions. I do the wrong and seem a saint when most I play the devil, as said earlier on for him. By him, he also expresses traits of a socially deviant lifestyle, such as a need for stimulation, poor behavioural control, irresponsibility, and many short-term marital relationships. I'll have her, but I will not keep her long. That's about Lady Anne. All these traits, however, scored at varying degrees of intensity, do not make Richard qualify as a psychopath. Richard's moment of remorse occurs in Act 5 when he is visited in a dream by all of those whom he had murdered. He wakes in a panic, terrified and unsure of himself, and utters a moving soliloquy. So, therefore, that whilst he may act in a psychopathic way, he is not a true psychopath. The character of Richard is created. So we've talked heavily about the fact that there are what is deemed to be kind of two sides to Richard. There might actually even be more. And I think when we look to the end of the play and see the regret and remorse, that might be our third side of Richard. So we see the side that he shows by himself, which is the creation of the villain. And then we see the side that he shows others, which is the charming side. And then perhaps towards the end of the play, we actually see the third side, which is his authentic side. So later in either this video or in a second part, we'll look at how that's come and how that creation of identity has been formed. Freud would say it's been formed by the fact that he's an exception, but there's other theories to it as well. So he cannot have those different sides, the true self, the villain self, all those, and the other one that he shows, the psychopathic narcissist self, all at the same time, and that comes to a halt in Act 5 during the ghost scene. So that's what makes that ghost scene so important, and the aftermath of that. So to take away from that, he shows psychopathic traits, and you can talk about that and look at those examples there, the sort of deviant lifestyle, the callous behaviour, the manipulative behaviour, but also the fact that those two can't coincide with his actual self, and that comes to a head in Act 5. So what is interesting to look at is how Shakespeare uses language to explore these things. So this helps us in our literature analysis of the text, because whilst those theories are important, it needs to come back to something concrete in the text to be able to look at. So if you're not familiar, Shakespeare follows what's called an iambic pentameter, which means there are 10 beats or syllables to a line, and in those it goes sort of stressed, unstressed, and so forth. So there's normally 10 beats, 10 syllables. What Shakespeare has done is taken this iambic pentameter, which is not his own invention, it existed pre-Shakespeare. He's just made it really well known. But then he introduced an 11th beat or 11th syllable in the line. And so when he did that to create something that is emotionally important. So the idea is that when there is a scene and there is 11 beats to the line, it makes it significant. So it's kind of like his cheat sheet to show everyone this is important. Another thing that he does is he puts the most important words at the end of the line so that there's an upward inflection or a pause or a lift, which we naturally do at the end of our sentences, particularly Kiwi women, where it sounds like a question at the end of the sentence. But he does that with certain words to place importance so that the audience is listening more actively, because you can miss the beginning of the line and hear the end of the line that creates an importance around it. So looking at words that end sentences and looking at how he manipulates the phrasing of the sentence to allow for that. And then another thing that he does to show importance and emotional importance and emotional freeness is use of vowels. So when there are open vowels, lots of O's, it's meant to show that the character is emotionally open. So if you see one or more, or a combination of these going on, it's sort of Shakespeare's way of hinting at the importance of something. So when analysing things, you should be looking for the syllables in a text, in a line, the words at the end of the line, and the use of O sounds. Words at the end of the line is probably the easiest one, and then probably O kind of sounds, and then the 11 syllables thing can be hard, but it is worth trying to pick out if you've got the time to do it. For somebody who would watch a lot of Shakespeare, they do kind of stand out because you get so used to a pattern, and that's what the iambic pentameter creates, quite a pattern and a flow, so it upsets the rhythm. And you would notice that if you listen to certain rap music and things, if they go away from the rhythm of what they've been saying for the previous 3 minutes, it often stands out. Cool. So that leads to here. So when we can see Richard being different, we can see that the language that Shakespeare has used supports that. So when he does find remorse, there are what they call feminine endings. So feminine endings is the 11 syllables. And that is where it's used in this line, "O coward conscience, how dost thou afflict me?" In this line, we see that the vowels are also prominent, meaning that the character is being emotionally open. It also has the feminine ending, deeming it to be wrought with true emotion. So that is Shakespeare's way of saying, yeah, this is actually not him playing the role of remorse. If you think back to Act 3, Scene 7, where he refuses to take the crown, he is playing somebody that is humble. He's playing and feigning that role of humbleness and modesty. But here, with Shakespeare's use of the O sounds, "O coward conscience, how dost thou afflict me?" and also the 11 syllables, which is what's the feminine ending, it's meant to show that this is him. This is the real Richard in action here. It's also important to think about the fact that this has come after a dream, so he isn't fully aware, and he is in somewhat of an unconscious phase of dreaming, and so he's able to actually release some of the villainous angst, and that makes him question himself and who he is, and that's when he says the line, "Is there a murderer here?" "No." Then really promptly straight after, "Yes, I am." So we are meant to take that as quite an authentic side of Richard, which the whole way through the play we think that the personal villainous side is authentic, and then this reading of it suggests that maybe it's not. Maybe that one is also just an identity that he's created as a way to deal with his own deformities. He has another final feminine line ending, which occurs with, "Methoughts the souls of all that I had murdered." And here he speaks the murder for the first time with emotion. So he realizes that he is no longer playing a part, and those whom he has murdered are not players on a stage. Richard's experiencing remorse in this scene. He refers to the murderers as hateful deeds committed by myself, and he says that his conscience has 1,000 several tongues, which brings with it several tales, and every tale condemns me for a villain. He knows what he has done is wrong, and he is feeling guilty as a result. So what we can take from this is that the identities and the formation of identities is where those psychoanalytic theories come in. They're the why or the how behind the identities, and then the language kind of is our evidence of this, and allows us to see some kind of something concrete that we can refer back to in essays. So I would take a note of the evidence that's there and take a note of what that shows. So basically, Shakespeare's used the language to show us that this is the real Richard because he has used the feminine endings, and which is the 11 syllables, and the rounded sounds, which are open emotion. So, how does this link with anything else? So, as I've said, those theories allow us to have a consideration of why Richard is the way he is. So, Freud proposes that Richard's lack of guilt, for majority of the play, is due to an unconscious guilt. So he takes out those vicious acts with without apparent empathy, and that guilt is actually rooted in the guilt that he feels for his deformity. So basically, because he's so deformed, or feels like he's so deformed, he carries some sort of unconscious guilt because of that. And so because he has that unconscious guilt, he is unable to feel perhaps guilt and empathy for the things that he actually does, because he's got that entitlement, and that's because of this exceptions theory or approach. So because he was so ugly and deformed, that leads him to think that. And so what you want to think about is how that links to his character's journey. The fact that he has a lack of success and a constant desire. Is he escaping his guilt by doing that? Is he processing his guilt? How does him constantly looking for other things fit with that? So we find evidence that his neurosis is in the very first monologue. I am determined to prove a villain. Richard is admitting here that he is not naturally a villain. So he says, I am determined to prove a villain. I'm determined to seem like I am one, which means, therefore, that he isn't one. So he's speaking of his desires, and he desires the role of the villain because he's unable to join in with joyful copulations, which means sex, which consume the time of others. He has made a conscious decision to create for himself a character to play to provide some entertainment whilst the country is at peace. Richard sets in motion a chain of desires which he wishes to meet, but he never truly satisfies. So I made a list of those there. So here we can see that he has an unconscious guilt, which is linked to his deformity, so he can't feel for anyone else. So all he has is his own not superficial, but super selfish approach. He wants to be a villain. He wants all these things. He has all these desires, and so that's the whole play, is him trying to get those desires, but also kind of never quite fulfilling them as well. So he takes Lady Anne, and then he also says, I will not keep her long. And then he goes for the crown and gets rid of his brother, but then sees the threat of the young boy, so he doesn't feel comfortable. He has Hastings killed or removed to try and remove an obstacle, because that's all he sees, is he gets things and then he just sees the downside or the bad side or something that's in the way still. So he gets the crown, but he doesn't feel accomplished, so he kills the boys. He wants to kill off Lady Anne and then marry his niece, because he doesn't feel secure in the positions that he's made. He removes Buckingham from his life to try and sort of get the complete security and desires that he wants. So my little reference there at the bottom, much like the Rolling Stones, Richard can't get no satisfaction. Nothing that he does ever allows him to completely fulfill his desires as a character. Yeah. So then comes into a classic Freudian discussion points. So there's something called the Oedipal complex. And to cut it short, you can go and then look at the origins of it. It says that something has happened with your mum that has caused you to create either lust for your mother or a need to remove your father to create a connection with your mother. So the Oedipal complex is very well known, and you're more than welcome to look them up. But it's a tale as old as time, and it is used by Freud in a lot of things. So yeah, it's quite bizarre. Anyway, so another theory is that it's not a desire that comes from guilt. In fact, his desire comes from his desire for his mother. So here we go. Richard never truly experienced his mother's desire in childhood because he was so deformed. And we know this because of how they talk about him with the children and things like that. I theorize that he is unconsciously attempting to experience it at this stage in his life. The mother's desire remained with the father when Richard was born. The mother took no interest in his premature deformed self. Richard has regressed to an Oedipal situation, wherein he is attempting to take the place of the father, the king, in order to experience the desire of his mother. Richard's true desire to be the cause of the desire for the mother to be the desired king fails. His mother publicly curses him, proving to him that he is not the cause of her desire. Not fully out of options yet, Richard turns to another mother, Queen Elizabeth, and attempts to seduce her into wooing her daughter on his behalf. His eloquent skill with language has weakened, and we fail to witness the same impassioned display with which he wooed Lady Anne. In the final act, we see him reject the crown as he has since realised that he has achieved his true desire to become a villain. I am a villain. He gives up the facade of being the king, my kingdom for a horse. So that's arguable. Anyway, we'll talk about that. Richard only ever felt an equal, a true being when in battle, and this is where he runs to now. He unmasked the villainous character he's created and returns to his true self, where he meets the end of his desire in death. So what to take from that is kind of up to you. There is a theory that it comes from an Oedipal complex, which is his need to create a connection with his mother. Okay, so you can take that or leave that. The other thing to take from that is just ultimately that he never reaches his desires, as mentioned in the previous slide. And then he's like, okay, I'm a villain, and then actually realizes that he's not a villain anyway. He's not a villain. He's not a king. The only place he actually truly felt comfortable was being a soldier and being in battle. And so that's when he's himself at the very end, and then death is almost his ultimate freedom from this at the end, to sort of reflect his very complex character. So I'm going to finish on this one and then start the next video as a separate one, so this doesn't go on forever and a day. But what can you take from the last sort of 10 minutes or so, more than that, of talking? So this is a summary page. Copy as you see fit, and then go back as you see fit. The text is a tragedy, as we create a connection with Richard through his dark but witty self, and also sympathy and a shared connection through his deformity of self, as we too blame things that happened in our youth for insecurities. So Freud and Lacan say that things that happen in your youth impact you as a person, and they create some insecurities, and then that impacts how we are as a person. So perhaps we too, as an audience, sympathize or empathize with that. In some ways, Richard is a psychopath, is psychopathic, but this is just a creation, and he can't truly hold on to those psychopathic villainous traits because they aren't necessarily his authentic self. The true self is revealed through his language, through his remorse, and also his actions in Act 5. He has guilt, but it's largely unconscious and linked to his deformity, which drives his character. We can assume this guilt is what drives or underpins his insatiable desires throughout the play, or we can see it as an Oedipal complex, which is mummy issues and a lack of acceptance. So because of that, he accepts the villain's role. Then right at the end, when he has no hope in hell of success and worn down by 5 acts of performance or masking, he is simply himself and he dies. So that's what I would take from that. I would perhaps copy that down, or at least listen through that again and see. So these are all linked to elements of Freudian or Lacan theory that our childhood defines us. hopefully that makes sense. Maybe watch this through one more time and take some notes. And then watch the second video because that goes into even more on Richard's identity and creation of identity.